So what I'm going to talk to you today, and thank you for the introduction, is about how political power is shifting as the energy system changes and how we increasingly decentralize. So just to begin, energy and our political systems have always been completely entangled. So modern democracies evolved in step with industrialization, with the use of coal and later oil and gas. And the picture that I have on the screen is from 1904, and it's a picture of standard, or a visualization of a standard oil tank that is sort of reaching towards the US White House. And so even back 100 years ago, more than that, people were seeing that energy industries really had a lot of influence in our political systems and had a lot to say about them. We tend to think of our democratic institutions, of our political institutions, as relatively stable, but in reality, we shape them. They are institutions. Institutions are the product of people. So they shift and they change over time based on our values, based on what we think is important, what we as a society or societies in different countries think are important. So they are going through slow, steady change. And sometimes that change is not so slow. And particularly now, we're seeing quite a bit of turbulence in the world, in our energy systems. And so it makes sense that we're seeing turbulence also in political systems. I mean, the energy transition is not the only reason for that turbulence, but it's quite intertwined. So it makes sense that we're seeing lots of turbulence. This, for some people who are quite interested in sort of stability and keeping things stable, a lot of the people who are in power who are benefiting from the current system, they would like to see things stay the same. But for those who are interested in a different world or in addressing some of the fundamental problems that we have in society today, this is actually quite hopeful. So it's viewed as an opportunity for change. So these cracks in stability of our current political system are viewed as a way that we can maybe see some larger scale change to address some of the problems that we have related to climate change, related to inequality, related to other things that are going on in the world. So that's what this talk is going to do today, is talk a little bit about how political decision-making happens in most democratic countries, the role that fossil fuel industries have played in our governments and political systems to date. Then I'll move on and talk a little bit about the energy transition that we're seeing, because we really are at a bit of a crossroads, although I would say we're maybe past that now, but I'll talk about it more, about pathways that focus on more centralized energy systems versus decentralized energy systems. I'll talk a little bit more about the political implications of decentralization, and then talk about what we're seeing on the ground. So what sort of changes we're seeing. Okay, so to talk about policymaking in democratic countries, if you've done any sort of classes ever in policy making or analyzing the policy process, you'll be familiar with this diagram. It's a classic, and basically it makes the argument that policy making goes through standardized cycles where we become aware of a problem, we define it, we identify how we might possibly address it, we pick a policy, we implement it, and then we look back and see how it's going. So it seems nice and tidy. It never happens this way in practice. It more often looks like this. So I've borrowed these slides from Peter Gluckman, who is the scientific advisor for New Zealand. And he has quite a long experience in being part of these policymaking processes. But basically, yes, it's useful to have an ideal heuristic that we would set our agendas, we would define our problems, we would pick them. But in practice, it's a messy mix of, yes, public opinion. So the ideal of a democratic system is that the will of the people is represented by elected representatives, and then decisions are made on their behalf. So yes, that definitely forms some part of it, but there's also a whole big mess of lobbyists for different interests, policy analysts, so the people who actually are in the government who are putting forward proposals based on their knowledge and their experience and their own biases, private sector, the actual legislators themselves. So everybody who's making a decision is also a person who has their own history and ideas. And all of that gets transferred into policy. So we don't have time to talk about all of this today, but we are going to talk about lobbying and the private sector, because those are two areas where energy industries are really quite active. Oh yeah, and it's important to mention that the way interest groups are treated really does depend on the political system in question. So it's different in different countries. So for example, in the Netherlands, where they have quite, well, they have a more flat system and a more consensual system, interest groups operate in quite a different way than they do in, say, the United States or the United Kingdom, for that matter, where there tends to be larger visible power imbalances and greater power for lobbyists. Okay. So when we talk about who has the capacity to influence the policy process, there are a number of different ways that different interest groups, either big energy interests or otherwise, anybody can try to intervene in a policy process. But in generally, those who are best at it are those who have access to political power. And that's what we're talking about today. And so I've done a fair bit of work through a project that took a look at how political power is expressed and how it changes in energy transitions right now. And so this list that you have on your screen is basically a representation of the more visible or the more prominent ways that groups are able to influence policy. And so if you're able to influence, it's likely that you, A, have money. So you can pay lobbyists, you can pay a team, you can hire people who are good at doing things, and that connects with having resources. So you're able to hire lawyers who can understand legislation and policy processes. You have technical experts who are able to understand, say, the dynamics of the energy system and how the grid works, or how markets work, those sorts of things. So you're really able to get in there and play the game. It's also easier to influence if you control vital resources. So if you control the energy system, the ability for the state to provide secure, stable, affordable energy to the population, it's much more likely that you'll be able to have the ear of government, because you're quite important to them getting reelected. Linked to that is controlling jobs. So governments who are in positions where a lot of people lose their jobs are unlikely to get reelected or likely to face consequences. And so if you're an industry or a group that controls jobs, you're likely to have more political influence. The same is true of controlling information. So a lot of governments don't have the capacity in-house to know everything they need to know about energy systems. And so they depend on industry for that. And this is, again, different in different countries, but in a lot of places, industry will control things like the knowledge about how much capacity the grid has, so how much the wires can physically handle. And they can say to government, well, you might want more decentralized generation, you might want to hook up more houses with rooftop solar, but the wires don't actually have the capacity in that region. And there's lots of examples from my own research and from research of others that industries are incentivized to control that information because to help protect their own interests. and to maybe misrepresent how much capacity the grid has in order to protect their own interests. So having control about key information like that is important for energy security also gives you influence. Another one is having elite level connections. So in general, big industries are heavily regulated, and because of that, they have working relationships with governments and regulators. And we want that. Like, that's a good thing that they have those relationships, because we want the government to be easily able to talk to the people who they need to be abiding by decisions. And so the other side of that is that it's quite easy for an industry to pick up the phone and say, well, this won't really work, or this proposed policy will affect our operations in this way, so maybe you want to think about changing that. So in some ways, it's a very legitimate thing, but in other ways, it allows them to influence in ways that someone like a community group or an NGO might not be able to, because they don't have those same connections. It's easier to influence if you have social legitimacy. So, for example, when the tobacco industry was viewed as socially legitimate, they were able to really quite easily influence governments and say, well, we should have these policies, or these health studies don't make sense. Once they lost that social legitimacy, when it became the science on cancer and smoking became clear, they were much less able to influence government. And finally, it's easier to influence if you can influence public opinion. So if you have the money to pay for newspaper ads or media that will shape people's minds and what they think. And so this could be something like car companies being able to buy ads that show people being really happy driving around on big country roads. So this ideal of individual autonomy and freedom that's associated with private cars. And so if you have that money, it's much easier to create that reality for people. So significantly, these are things that for a long time the oil and gas industry have had. Some of it is shifting, so social legitimacy is shifting, and ability to influence public opinion is somewhat shifting. So we're seeing some changes, but for a long time, this has been a very comfortable position. So it's been quite easy for industry to shape public policy, and a lot of times for really good reasons, because they've been providing a really valuable resource to society. And also, like, oil is amazing. It's an incredibly dense resource, and it's incredibly valuable. So we've been quite lucky to have it. We've realized that the flip side of using it is the destruction of the planet. But for a long time, with the knowledge that we had, this system sort of made sense. It doesn't make sense anymore. And so I suppose the other thing to note is that it's not just big industries who can have access to these levers of political power. Other people can have these things too, or other groups, which I'm sure is obvious through things like Fridays for the Future movements, or environmental NGOs, or health groups having social legitimacy, control over resources, those things too. Okay. So in terms of the role that fossil fuel industries have played in political systems, as I mentioned, they've had tremendous political power, and they've generally used that political power to ensure themselves operating conditions that are safe and secure and are profitable. So corporations are legally obligated to make profits. So this ends up being their driving motivation. It means that if an activist CEO somehow managed to be elected to a board of directors, even if they really wanted to aggressively target environmental or social outcomes, if that impacted profitability or returns to shareholders too much, it's likely that they would be voted out, because the structure of the system is set up that they will pursue profitability at all costs. So there's sort of, in terms of outcomes beyond profitability, there's a bit of a fundamental flaw in the model. But it means that what we've seen in practice is that they've been very good at pursuing policies that ensure their profitability, because that's their job. So what that means in practice in politics is opposing policies that would limit their ability to pursue profits. So things like energy, climate, environmental policy, and even social policy sometimes. And they've often been quite successful at that. And so the figure that's on the screen is from 2019, and it's the amount of money that the 5 biggest oil companies have put into lobbying against climate action at the EU level. And so the total is 201 million, but these are companies, so Shell in particular has been making statements that like they're trying to transition, they're interested in moving forward, but even while they're doing that, on the other hand, they are still lobbying to try to weaken climate protections. So it's, I mean, it's an interesting strategy. It seems to be working for them so far, but again, there are consequences in terms of social legitimacy. All right, so I have here some examples of ways at sort of national or subnational levels that energy companies have intervened in political processes, using their connections, using those resources or those levers that I talked about earlier. So Magda Smink in her PhD, which was published in 2015, looked at gas producers in the Netherlands. And one of her papers talked about how in the emergence of biomethane in the Netherlands, the existing gas industry, which was quite powerful, continues to be quite powerful, but is declining. They used their connections to regulators and to policymakers to make it harder for biomethane producers to participate in energy markets. And they also ran a really big public campaign and a campaign targeting policymakers as well to make arguments that biomethane wasn't a secure energy source, that it didn't make sense, and that they would be better sticking with natural gas. Another example from Canada that I've done research on, but also a number of other people, talks about how incumbent interests in the case of Ontario, in Canada, this is interest from oil and gas, previously from coal, although coal has now been phased out there, and also from the nuclear industry and their associated unions, so the workers who work in those industries. And these actors have all lobbied really aggressively and quite successfully to weaken support for renewables and to ensure a phase out or an ending to the feed-in tariff policy that was there. And the end result is that renewables aren't even prioritized in this region anymore in terms of if they're in competition with carbon-based resources. So they've been quite successful there. Another example I have is from the United States, which is always a great example for if you want to talk about influence in policymaking, because the US system is so incredibly influenced by lobbying by private interests. But in the US, there are, well, there used to be 2 Koch brothers. Now there's only one of them because one of them passed away. But they're sort of this oil and energy family, like a dynasty. And they early on realized that, that rooftop solar was really going to impact their profitability, or that renewables would impact their profitability. So this article is from 2016, but there are current examples as well. But they went out and they proactively lobbied state governments in places that hadn't even thought about having a feed-in tariff scheme or a net metering scheme or something that would make it easier for people to own rooftop solar or participate in a community wind project, for example. So they went out and they said to legislators, oh, we need to change these rules just to make the market better. But the end result was they were quite strategic in making it difficult for people to have rooftop solar. So it's really hard to incentivize people to put rooftop solar on the roofs. And what they've essentially done is really slowed down the energy transition across the US, protecting their interests, but also slowing down an energy transition that really needs to happen. So those are all examples of trying to influence energy policy, but there are also really a lot of examples of energy influencing other environmental and social policies. So I'm Canadian, so I have lots of good examples from Canada. This is another one from Canada, but it's an example where all the oil industries, so Canada has the tar sands, it has a lot of energy companies and indigenous resources. So these companies banded together because the government was looking to make some changes to environmental policy, and they basically demanded changes to a whole suite of environmental policies, including on fisheries, on environmental assessments, and on protections for water systems. And they were successful. There was a very receptive government at that time who liked the oil industry. And so they were really successful at getting word for word their demands into the policies. And this was well documented by the national broadcaster after the fact. Didn't make the changes, like the changes stayed, but people knew that they had happened. And then finally, I mentioned that energy companies sometimes also get involved in social policy. So this is again from the US, and this is, there is research talking about how in some places that have significant environmental justice impacts related to oil and gas in the US, those industries will actually fund police departments to make sure that those protests against environmental injustices don't impact their operations and profitability, which is a bit, like quite scary, a bit 1984. Yeah, it's not a very hopeful picture, but I mean, the hopeful part is that it is changing. But oil and gas have had and continue to have a lot of influence on our governments and institutions. A lot of this influence in the past made sense because they controlled vital resources like jobs and economic growth. I wouldn't say that all of that influence made sense or was healthy, but there was some sort of argument for why it made sense. But at the same time, a lot of this influence has been used to limit environmental and social protections, which is part of the reason we're in the social and environmental situation we're in now. And it's been used to slow down an energy transition that will diminish the super profitability of oil and gas. And when I say super profitability, what I mean is that oil and gas is pretty remarkable as a resource that is easy to control. So you can own an oil field, you can own a coal mine. It's really difficult to own the wind. So the position where you could completely control a resource and how much it costs that's ending. There will never be, again, be the opportunity to be that profitable with oil and gas. Okay, so to move on to talk a little bit about the energy transition that we're seeing. So, I mean, an energy transition is happening. It's quite obvious it's happening. We're increasingly seeing countries make net zero or carbon neutral pledges. Wind and solar are reaching grid parity. The energy transition is happening. As part of that, we're also seeing a massive transition towards electricity. So when we talk about the energy system, we often talk about the power or electricity sector, heating and transport. And they have in the past been relatively separate, but what we're seeing with the electrification of transport through things like EVs and the electrification of heating, so the move from things like gas boilers or coal furnaces to electric heat pumps, is that much more of our energy demand is going to be coming in the form of electricity. And so IRENA has put out, or the International Renewable Energy Agency has put out estimates that, that this shift could mean that we see a move from about 20% of our final electricity use being through electricity to 45%. And in some places, this could move up to 60%. So that's a significant shift in how we use energy. All right, so within that, what we have seen historically in most developed countries, or at least for the industrialized era, is that we've progressed towards centralized energy systems. So it's quite common to have a system where we have a small number of big resources, things like coal plants or nuclear plants, oil, gas-fired plants, and they feed out electricity. They generate, they feed out electricity through the grid to consumers who just consume the energy and don't have any other role in the system. With decentralization, you see many more resources, so it's possible to generate in different places. And now generation from renewables needs to be more geographically diffuse because wind and solar, geothermal are located all over the place. And we also need much more. We need many more of these generation assets because renewables, the energy density of renewables is much lower. So we need a lot more space. Basically what that means is that we need to do the same amount of work, for those who remember their physics classes, to do the same amount of useful work from energy, we need much more space for renewables than we would for oil and gas. So we're going to need some degree of decentralization. There's also been some interesting research coming out recently about how decentralization just makes a whole lot of economic sense. So this is from the US, but I anticipate that other countries will be doing this soon. And it's modeling from Chris Clack and his team at Vibrant Clean Energy. And basically, they've done some research looking at a number of different scenarios. So a business as usual scenario, a scenario that meets the clean energy standard, but is or their clean energy targets, but is business as usual, and then distributed scenarios. And basically what they find is that if you start to integrate a lot of rooftop solar, a lot of decentralized resources, in addition to existing centralized resources, there's a savings by 2050 of $450 billion US, based on the fact that there's you're not losing money to things like having to upgrade wires, having to install new transmission systems. And this is while meeting the clean energy commitments. And so it involves an investment, so net loss up to 2030, but then that goes up. So that's the green line on the graph. So they started doing that modeling for the UK and for other places. But the basic argument is that decentralization and accepting decentralization makes a lot of sense. But there's still conflict over this. So there's centralization. It's what we're used to. Our institutions are built up around it. It favors large-scale renewables, large-scale concentrated sources, traditional business models, and a small group of actors making decisions because there's a small group of actors controlling those resources. Decentralization really shakes up that system. It means that things are more diffuse. You have many more actors, many more small-scale renewables. You have a mix of people of prosumption, so people producing and consuming energy, also storing. You have microgrids, and you're seeing different business models because people are interested in participating in the system in different ways. So not just profit maximizing, but things like cooperatives or nonprofit associations. And while there's really emerging quite broad academic consensus that the future is going, for at least the foreseeable future, will be a mix of centralized and decentralized resources. There's still a lot of conflict over these pathways. And so Marie Lindberg and colleagues did research at the EU level, looking at interests, and basically there's a big division. So people can generally agree, I mean, we're moving towards renewables, although there was still some conflict over that, but there's really big fault lines over whether those pathways will be centralized or decentralized, despite the fact that decentralization is already happening. And the reason that happens is because it's a significant change. It threatens people's economic interests. It threatens also, I mean, our system is set up. It requires institutional changes and changes to our infrastructure. It's a big change. So just to get a little bit more specifically into the political implications of decentralization. So when resource ownership is centralized, that means that political power is also centralized. So if we go back to that list of sort of levers or ways to influence policy processes, the ability to control information, to have money, to speak to regulators, that's centralized within a small group of actors. And so it makes it easier for those actors to realize their political goals. And we've also talked earlier about how those goals tend towards profit maximization, and that is often at the expense of other environmental or social outcomes that we as a society might think are important, but aren't captured by the imperative of profit maximization. So what decentralization does is that it shakes up that system, it changes who's in control, it dilutes that political power. And it means that you have many new interests who might have different values. They might ask for different things in policymaking than just profit maximization. I mean, they might ask for profit maximization, but in practice, that's not what we're seeing on the ground. And the picture there is just a tweet from, I think it was November or October of last year, about Spain's net zero strategy, where part of that is to lower their energy dependence from about 75% to 13%. But in practice, what that really means is a transfer of wealth from foreign oil producers to local people or local companies, however they decide to do it. And so it really has significant implications geopolitically in terms of national economy and local economy as well. All right, one important thing to note is that energy that is decentralized and local is not necessarily the same as something called community energy, which I'll talk about more. So it doesn't, just having resources decentralized doesn't necessarily mean that market shares or ownership will be distributed. So it's entirely possible to have one company rent space on people's roofs, for example, but still own all the generation infrastructure, still be the one who talks to government, still control the jobs, and still control that resource. And that's something that, I mean, we saw moves towards that, for example, in the UK, when the feed-in tariff came in, some companies recognized, like, this is a lot of money, we could really do this. And so they would ask people who might not know much about the scheme, oh, can we rent your roof? You'll be able to use some energy for free, but we'll collect the feed-in tariff. And the feed-in tariff was quite generous at that time, so they were making a huge amount of money. And these people who didn't necessarily have the expertise or the knowledge to participate in the system, they were allowing their rooftops to be used, but not capturing the full range of benefits. So it's quite possible that systems could go that way. If that happens, though, it helps decarbonize to an extent, but it doesn't change any of the control over markets or the political power dynamics. And so this is significant. I mean, we need, obviously, changes in carbon budgets. We need decarbonization, but there are increasing arguments that unless we address inequality, unless we address injustices in the energy system, we're not going to see an energy transition, because all the upper middle class people in the world can change their behavior, and that won't change the way that that people who are experiencing poverty or who don't have access to resources use energy. Sometimes you just use what you have, and if that's coal or if that's like a tank of propane, that's what you use if you don't have other options. So centralized ownership of our energy system is a problem, because issues of income inequality, issues of inequality in policymaking are hand in hand or intertwined with climate change, destroying our prospects for continuing life on our planet. So there are increasing arguments that we need to address both of these at the same time. And decentralization and more diffuse ownership of the energy system is argued to be one of the ways that this is possible. The other thing is that we need a fast transition, and there is more and more evidence that people are much more likely to accept renewables, to be on board, to change their behavior if they're actually engaged, if they're making money from the transition, if they're active participants. So we really do need a lot of people all over the place. We need all of us engaged in some way to facilitate an energy transition. There are a lot of people who are already talking about this, and there's an entire subfield or a sort of discipline spanning field called energy democracy. And they really focus a lot on decentralization of the energy system. So energy democracy itself is an ideal. So framed as something that we will potentially never reach, but it's useful to have it as sort of this idealized goal, where citizens are the recipients, stakeholders, and account holders of the entire energy sector policy. And that comes from Kasper Zulecki. Within that, there are all sorts of other characteristics of energy democracy, where the energy system is viewed as being broadly participatory, focused on local economic development, focused on community development, with high levels of political engagement, and focuses on things like justice, equity, environmental responsibility. And there's lots of evidence that where we see distributed or decentralized community energy projects, that we do see those things. So we see an increase in public or political participation. We see local economic development. So there's a lot of movement there. So if we talk about who does energy democracy, this is part of the problem and one of the things that we need to address to make it work. So the people who do it tend to be prosumers, so people who both produce and consume electricity, and also increasingly store electricity, so have batteries as well. Energy cooperatives or communities, cities and municipalities are increasingly recognizing that they can have a role in the energy system, so they're increasingly engaging in energy projects, and all sorts of other business models that are focused on nonprofit. So in addition to cooperatives, things like in the UK, they have, I forget what they call it, community something. It's basically a cooperative under another name, or citizen ownership programs. But there are lots of business models that are different from that traditional profit maximizing one that fit under the banner of energy democracy. Now, the challenge is that to date, what we've largely seen is that there's a huge bias in participation towards people, sort of the Western world. So upper middle class, well off, well educated, and also predominantly male participants. And these are people who have money and expertise and time, and they want to get involved. And so, I mean, the world is already slanted that way. So if we want a more just world or a more equal world, that will need to change. It's useful to recognize that bias is not an inevitability. It's there because we've kind of let the sector develop on its own. But with intentional policies, it's quite possible to have these distributed energy projects, a distributed energy system benefit everybody. You just have to put the supports in place for people to be able to access the market, have access to infrastructure like panels, and supported in being able to take part. And that is happening in a lot of different places as well. But it is something that we need to sort out if we're going to have, if we're going to capture the benefits that are possible through energy decentralization from sort of a political and a social and environmental perspective. So to talk a little bit more about energy democracy and political power, it's important to talk about the motivations that people have for engaging in politics as energy actors, because this will, in theory, drive their political goals. So whereas under traditional business models, we've seen, for example, oil companies asking for conditions to maximize profits, the theory from energy democracy is that community energy groups will ask for things like more progressive environmental policy, more progressive social policy. They're definitely also interested in the conditions that will allow them to be economically secure, but that will be just one priority amongst equals. And so, just as an example, the picture there, depending on your screen size, it might be a bit small, but it's an example of, I actually cut off most of the list, but of beneficiaries from a community energy project in Scotland it's a community-owned dam, actually. So it's a hydropower project, but they take their profits, they give some back to their shareholders or the cooperative members, and the rest of it they put towards local economic development or community goals. So things like buying uniforms for their fire cadets, buying pain relief equipment for their first aid service. So different sort of things that help to support life in their community. But the point is that even a partial redistribution of asset or electricity system ownership will have big political implications, because it's easier to influence policy if interests are aligned and organized, and essentially it just involves these groups moving from the margins to not really having a voice to having some sort of political voice and influence. And that can be enhanced if community energy interests organize, or decentralized interests organize into lobby groups. And this is something that we're seeing increasingly in different places. So recognizing that these decentralized energy interests have political goals. So they want the conditions that will allow them to operate. They want supports. They want a more equitable playing field. So they're recognizing that they need to work together. And you're seeing across the world at the EU level that you're increasingly having lobbying organizations. In some cases, governments are supporting that. So they're saying, hey, you're all saying different things to us, you distributed energy interests. Why don't you get together? We'll support you, and you can come talk to us with one voice, because that's just much easier for politicians. Again, it's easier to influence if they're able to form partnerships and have alignment of interests. So to say a city or environmental interests, hey, we're all talking about the same thing. Why don't we work together and ask for one thing from government to achieve one goal? And that's also a way that that they're increasing their political power. And then if they request outcomes that are substantially different from the status quo, so things that are progressive from an environmental and social perspective, then they'll be addressing these things that socially we're saying we want. So, you know, climate policy that works, air quality standards that protect people's health, then they're asking for things that the government is being asked to do anyways. Okay, so at the very least, spreading out some of that political power, deconcentrating it from oil industries, means that those industries will have less power, political power, to do things like block climate legislation, which is a very good thing. So yeah, deconcentration of political power in the energy sector is, I mean, it's sort of win-win unless you're an energy company looking to protect your profits. Okay, so for the last few minutes, I'm just going to talk about some examples of how we're seeing shifts in political power and political outcomes with decentralization. So the biggest example I have actually happened in 2018, and that is when ResCoop, which is .eu, which is the European Association for Energy Cooperatives, led this charge at the EU level to have the new Renewable Energy Directive contain provisions for community energy. And they were successful, which was surprising to, I think, as surprising to them as to everybody else. But basically, they were able to get the laws shaped or changed to say that by this month, actually, all member states have to have legislation in place to enable energy communities. And these are community energy projects specifically that are owned by citizens, by SMEs and local authorities. They can't have profit maximization as an overriding goal. They are open and inclusive in terms of their participation, and individual shares are capped. So it can't be controlled by any one interest. And so really they're envisioned to be much more democratic, a much more open way of organizing energy systems. And this is happening as we speak. I've been doing some research into what this looks like on the ground. Member states are sort of like fumbling through it, but it's happening. It's happening. And so it remains to be seen. Like, we're seeing it all play out now, but there's going to be, or there should be, if the intent of the legislation is upheld, there should be a shift in energy systems over the next decade that is quite significant. Another good example is the emergence of cities as energy actors. And this has been it's been a massive shift over the last 10 or 15 years. So cities have really clued into the fact that they have capacity and resources. They're also responsible for addressing many of the issues that local energy can address. So things like energy poverty, safe and secure housing, local economic development, and also local climate action. So they recognize this as something that makes sense. They're strong political actors, so they're used to talking to higher levels of government. And the other thing that I actually don't have on this slide is that they also have a bit more freedom. So yes, cities definitely get lobbied by people like developers. They're often captured or have strong regulatory relationships, but they don't necessarily have those relationships with oil and gas companies. So oil and gas companies are used to lobbying at the national level. Energy utilities, like they have those working relationships, but companies haven't lobbied cities because there was no reason for them to. So they have a bit more political freedom. They don't have those sort of strong ties, those relationships that might prevent them from making really progressive moves in the energy sector. So they've become really interesting. The other really interesting things that's happened is that decentralization is happening no matter what. So, so even in places where governments aren't supportive, infrastructure is cheap enough and people are sort of cluing in enough that people are finding ways to make it happen. So in the UK, for example, in 2015, the government essentially cut all supports for community energy or really for local energy. They got rid of the fee, or they said they were going to phase out the feed-in tariff, but you've continued to see groups try to find ways to continue. So they've moved into energy services. They're trying to work together to find new ways to participate in markets. And so growth in the sector has sort of slowed from like it's leveling off a bit, but it's still increasing. Sorry, it hasn't slowed, it's just leveled off. Growth has leveled off. But people are still finding ways to do it and increasingly having their voice heard. In the US, there's a whole range of projects that are specifically focused on low-income neighborhoods, on underrepresented areas, and bringing energy, addressing energy insecurity, and these are just happening, and this was happening under Trump as well. So groups were recognizing, well, we don't have national or sometimes state level support, but we're still going to do this anyways because we can find ways to do it. And then this one is from the town of Banff, which is in the Canadian Rockies, in the province of Alberta, which has a very oil-focused government, but they're using their own municipal funds to try to incentivize people to put solar on the rooftops. So people are finding ways to make it happen just because decentralization makes sense. So to conclude, ownership of electricity generation is already diversifying. We're seeing a shakeup of politics, and it's only going to get bigger. But the thing in question is sort of the degree of political disruption. So that's going to depend on how much market shares shift, so how diffuse energy ownership gets, how politically organized new actors are. So when I was talking about forming lobby groups and being able to make coalitions, it really does depend on the degree to which existing governments are open to change. So in places where you have really progressive governments, I mean, the Netherlands is a good example again. So they have some really good rules on the books for decentralized energy, but they're also much more open to that sort of thing. The UK has, since 2015, been very against it, and the policy environment is not great. So people are having to do things under the radar. And then finally, how much actors can agree on their political goals. So this is, again, if anybody works with advocacy coalition frameworks, it really does make it easier to influence if people can speak with one voice. And then again, just this final point that at the very least, reducing the power of oil and gas industries to have governments do what they want is a really good thing, regardless of what else happens. Okay. That's basically the end. I just wanted to note that this builds on work that was done for a project that I led called the Power Shifts Project. And I'll make these slides available also because I've got a whole list of references there that people might be interested in. So yeah, I'll stop sharing there and then hopefully we can have a good conversation about things.
Okay, thank you very much for this interesting topic. I'll just start with questions that were raised in the chat box and then maybe save my questions for the last part if there will be time. So if any of other participants still have questions, you can raise hands or add them to the chat box. So I will start with a question from Satoru Mizoguchi from Japan. How do you measure waning or diminishing and rising of social legitimacy of an industry? Maria, you also have all the questions in the chat if you want to follow them there.
Okay. Okay, and do you want me to take them one by one, or do you want to collect a few?
I think it would be easier.
Yeah, I mean, okay, the social legitimacy question is interesting because, I mean, you end up using indicators with any social science sort of concept that's a bit diffuse. You end up having to use indicators to look at it. And so things to measure social legitimacy, it is things like what is showing up in the newspapers, what people are asking for, what's being represented in politics, but also in what political decisions are coming out. So are you seeing decisions that continue to favor oil and gas industries or not? Or that act against them? So I guess, I mean, a few years ago, it would have been unthinkable for courts to rule that that companies needed to address climate legislation. And we've seen that in the Netherlands, we've seen it in Germany. We may see that in Canada, in the UK. There are lots of examples. But yeah, it's essentially coming up with a set of indicators which are representative of what people are thinking, and it'll be different for different sectors of society, but when you can get alignment amongst sectors, then you can sense that like the mood is shifting.
Okay, then we had some comments regarding the grid and the grid operators' concerns and their everyday mantra that with decentralized energy, the grid costs will be higher. And then regarding to that, Sibyl Lustenberg from Switzerland is asking a question. Do you have experience in transdisciplinary cooperation between social sciences and engineering sciences? What are the challenges and how can such cooperation be successful?
Okay, two good questions. Yeah, so for the first one, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for grid operators because the world is changing really quickly and they're responsible for keeping the lights on and making sure that things work. And decentralization, it's a really big shift. And grid costs will go up on one level. So the way the grid is set up now, it means that it's sort of like in your body, you've got sort of arteries and then you move out and then you have capillaries. So they're quite small at the edges, but what we need now is wires that are able not just to receive energy at the household level, but also transmit it back. So a lot of those wires will need to be upgraded. Now, the other side of that is that we're going to need fewer high voltage transmission lines than we would. I mean, we may end up needing them anyways with increased electrification. But yeah, it's part of the game. Like if we're going to shift our energy system, then we need to invest in the grid. Most grids need upgrades anyways, because infrastructure in most countries is chronically underfunded. But it's basically a policy commitment. Like this is going to cost money. We need to do it to ensure life on Earth. So we need to invest in the grid. But I definitely have sympathy for grid operators, but they need to, I mean, in some places they are grid operators are on board. So again, I mean, I studied the Netherlands, so I use it a lot as an example, but a lot of grid operators there are saying, okay, we see this change is happening. We can't do it on our own. We need social and government support to do this. Give us this support and we will be on board. We'll help make it happen. And that I think is quite a productive way to do it. On the question of transdisciplinarity, yeah, it's tough. My background is in engineering. So my master's was in engineering. And then I got really frustrated because all the technical solutions I knew would work, I didn't understand why they weren't working. And the answer, of course, is because humans are social beings. And the social side determines whether a technical solution will work or not. So when I moved on and did my PhD, I did it in social sciences. And I would, yeah, it was an interesting personal journey to move from sort of physical sciences and engineering to social sciences. But it made me appreciate the difficulties of working in transdisciplinary teams, because there's a lot of fundamental misunderstanding about what counts as evidence, what counts as data, what is truth. And so we could have a really big, long conversation about ontologies and epistemologies. But basically, if you're going to work together, it involves agreeing on sort of what you're looking to get out of it. It involves a lot of base work. So you have those conversations up front. It's hard in a remote world because it's best to meet people in person so that you can sort of have those conversations. It takes time. You need to be able to recognize when you're understanding things from different perspectives. And you can often find that because when points of conflict arise, it usually is because there's a misunderstanding about what you're looking at. But yeah, I'm working in several transdisciplinary teams right now, looking at things like having complementarity of resources. So balancing solar and wind and other resources at a local scale with local ownership to try to make sure that you can balance variability between resources amongst users. But yeah, it's a lot of conversations is basically the answer to that question.
So I would have a question adding to this one. Are obstacles bigger in, let's say, this engineering technology part or in the social part of the system? Obstacle for change in energy transition.
Yeah, in the social side, it's 100% in the social side. We have the technical knowledge we need to change the energy system. We've had it for decades. Like we had wind technology in the 70s. Like there were the first cars were electric. Like if we wanted to make transitions, we could do it. But I would say it's social and political and economic systems. So we have these structures, these institutions built up around the way we do things now. And institutional change takes time. Personal change takes time. So changing our own behaviors. And there's really good evolutionary reasons for this. Like we are as humans resistant to change because if we're feeling safe and secure in a situation at a fundamental level, it doesn't make sense to leave that. And climate change is a tricky one because we can still personally feel safe and secure, even though we know this big existential crisis is happening. But until like the heat wave, as they're happening now, or the wildfire, or the flooding, or the extreme storms are happening to us, we continue to feel safe and secure. And so we're working through that process now of trying to rush people in our institutions to change, and it's understandably causing a lot of friction, but it's something that we need to do, and it's something that we need to work through. But I don't think any of us could expect to get through this without significant social upheaval.
So maybe adding to this, why then when we speak about the future of energy or electricity system and sectors, and changes in it, why it's always presented as the engineering or engineers part of the as they're the only ones that have a role in saying in what will be done, what should be done. And we're listening this, I think, that in majority of the countries.
Yeah, I mean, that's because we have a bias in general towards technical solutions. And this is, it's easier to think that technology will come and save the day than that we need to change our processes, our operations, our way of doing things. It's much easier to have a quick fix. And there's lots of research. So you're going to hear from Benjamin next, but you can ask him to talk a little bit about the bias in research funding. So way more funding goes to natural sciences and engineering than goes to social sciences in the energy sector. And there's increasingly, like, it's all being published in Nature in the past couple of years, that the problem is social. We have the technical solutions, the problem is social. And so I would say, I mean, if you're at this talk, you're probably focused at least a bit on social solutions, but this is where the work needs to be done. Also in convincing governments that on the social side is where things need to happen, not just social, but also political and economic.
Okay, thanks. Then we go to the question from Sierra Fabienne from Switzerland as well. Community energy and taking up ownership, feed-in tariffs and so on goes with the responsibility. So the citizens actually want to take up this responsibility and actively engage in decentralized electricity production. Most people don't know how much electricity they use, so is it realistic to say that society as a whole wants more political power and be part of the energy transition? Yeah, no, this is a really important question because most people don't. Most people don't have the bandwidth or the capacity to do that. Like, you get home, you feed your kids, you like try to have some sort of social life if possibly, and you go to bed and then you wake up and go to work. So a lot of people don't have the bandwidth to be thinking deeply about, well, how much capacity is on the grid and what's the voltage and all of this. And so what it really, what we need, and I've actually written another paper about this, about governance of the energy system. It's basically what we need is a system that allows people to engage to the extent that they want. So it should be possible for people to not have to think about it. It should be quite easy to get panels put on your roof and have that quite a simple process. It's much easier with digitalization. A lot of people have concerns about digitalization because of data ownership. And so there really needs to be good work done on data ownership to facilitate digitalization. And that means that people need to feel comfortable that their data won't be exploited, that it won't be used to generate profits for somebody else in ways that invades their privacy. And we're not there yet in a lot of countries. But basically, there are a lot of different ways we can set up a system that allow people to be engaged to the extent that they want to be engaged. It's just a very different system architecture, but it's not one that is completely unfamiliar. So a lot of places do have various levels of engagement with systems. For example, water systems. A lot of people in cities are on city water. And the analog would be a lot of people in cities might just be connected to the grid as normal. They might have panels on the roof, but then other people have wells, they have private systems. So there's a mix of different ways to set up a resource system. It just involves us thinking differently about how we govern energy systems, who's responsible for what, and what the architecture looks like. So how the system is set up. Thank you. I would maybe ask Andrei Clements if he can present the questions orally, because he asked 2 or 3 or 4 questions, and it will be easier, I think, than to read everything.
Okay. Okay, I will start with my last question. What would be with the legitimacy of decentralized power generation if the typical new actor is a well-off male living in a relatively large private house and a driving Tesla car? If this is the main image of new in media presentation of decentralized energy, I'm afraid that in the countries like ours, it will be hard to get broad support for this kind of decentralization of generation, power generation.
Yeah, I mean, it would be hard to get support from me for that as well. Yeah, it's so the way that the decentralized energy system has evolved to date in the West is that it's been taken forward by people who often retired engineers, who have time, who have money, who like they would play with these things in their spare time anyways. And that's, I mean, it's great. Those people have done a lot of work in proving feasibility, but there is a step between proving sort of technical, social feasibility and broader expansion to something that's appropriate for the rest of society and something that's accessible for the rest of society. So my argument here is that this is where we need government. This isn't going to happen without government support. We know how it works now. We know what business models potentially work. It's changing the profile of who's participating and who benefits. So it's making sure it's not just white men being able to do this, or upper middle class people. It's making sure that there are policies in place that support people to have access to energy generation assets, that support them in supports for, okay, this is how this works, in broad sweeps. So not necessarily this is how we moderate voltage, but this is how this works. Again, it can be facilitated by digitalization. There are also lots of issues with people who don't have capacity being able to trust or being willing to participate in digitalization, because again, that trust isn't there. It's not viewed as legitimate. A lot of this stems from larger power imbalances and people being taken advantage of in the past. But basically, it's sort of like a catch-22. So we need the system to be legitimate for people to take part. And in order for people to take part, we need the system to be legitimate. And the entry point to that is, I think we need responsible government intervention that is thoughtful and intelligent, and supports the people who need support.
Okay, I will continue from a more abstract political perspective. I mean, in my sense, in my opinion, we are living in a context of transforming of liberal democracy presentation institutions into illiberal democracy, whatever that means. And this trend is massively backed up with increasing legitimacy of nuclear power. Especially with governmental plans backed up by our US friends to build another nuclear power plant and solve the problems. In this context, I mean, I have a kind of Leninist political question: how to make an alliance that would be able to oppose it, and not only oppose it in terms of a cultural clash. We, the goods who are pro renewable, against those old bastards and so on. But in terms of addressing an adequate policy.
Yeah, it's
just to let me finish.
Okay.
Wouldn't be in this context more important now to have a kind of renewable energy coalition of centralized and decentralized actors as to pledge for an ideal decentralized system where the focus will be, or the main policy will be, on enable decentralized players to really flourish.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, with the RED 2, the Renewable Energy Directive 2 at the EU level, there is, I mean, I wouldn't say everybody's on board with that consensus, but the official policy is to support decentralized actors through legislation, and we're going to see how that plays out. But your larger question of forming coalitions, So yeah, my stance on nuclear power is that, like, it's really expensive. It doesn't make economic sense at all. And like, it doesn't make economic sense in the short term. It really doesn't make economic sense in the long term, because sort of the long-term forever costs of storage of waste and containment are, I mean, they're astronomical. But the other thing is that we don't need it. And for people who are really in support of nuclear, I mean, you can take a look at like the UK, where they're really having trouble getting any nuclear built because it's not economically feasible, and it keeps getting canceled. But with a decentralized system, even with the centralized renewable resources that we already have on the books, things like hydropower or large-scale wind, offshore wind, solar, we're not going to need nuclear. So, I mean, I can marshal any number of arguments against nuclear. Also, it's extremely risky under extreme conditions because it needs water for cooling. And if the water's too hot, then the plants have to be ramped down. In any case, it's a whole other argument. But the larger argument is, I'd recommend taking a look at the Vibrant Clean Energy report. They have a whole, it's listed in the citations, but just about the economics of a system with massive decentralization. This also includes centralized resources. It makes no sense to throw out the ones that we have, and we're going to need more with more electrification. But yeah, and it is what you're talking about, building those coalitions, but based on sort of sound arguments about what things actually cost.
Okay, we're just going to take two more questions because we don't have much time, and they're already in the chat, so no more new ones. The first one is from Linda Connor. In our research on energy transition in Upper Spencer Gulf, South Australia, we are finding that cities or local government are quite disempowered in achieving good outcomes from large-scale renewable developments in these disadvantaged areas. Like many rural regions, in South Australia, they have low socioeconomic indicators, trends toward deindustrialization, and some population decline. There's also policy neglect from the metropole and low municipal revenues. Do you have any examples of energy democracy in these situations?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there are examples of community groups in the US. I would have to get back to you with specifics about where, because I can't pull it up off the top of my head, but where community groups in low income areas have, sort of with the blessing of local governments, engaged in projects, but often grants from foundations or funds. But that's not the city doing anything. And this trend of cities being disempowered with respect to large scale projects, that makes a lot of sense, because those decisions often get made on high, and there are lots of examples about higher level governments overriding city governments to put in like big wind farms that the community hasn't accepted, which is problematic. It is really extremely problematic because you need that bottom up support and participation. I would say take a look at that Energy Democracy Collaborative website from the US for examples of that, because that's exactly the situation that a lot of places are looking at and where you are seeing action. Although some of it might be more inner city, which is a bit of a different context, but there will be some comparable or relatable examples, I think.
Okay, thank you. And the last question from Dana Powell from USA. What about energy governance in political systems that are not states, where infrastructure is already compromised by colonial power? I'm thinking of indigenous nations who may pursue fossil fuels as a strategy to disrupt colonial settler control.
Yeah, it's a good question, because often communities use the resources that they have when they have run out of other political levers. We are seeing across the US and Canada, in particular, New Zealand as well, Indigenous communities who are increasingly taking control of renewable energy development. There also, interestingly, has been some level of government support specifically for these communities to participate in community energy projects. But yeah, where they are using oil and gas to try to gain leverage, it's hard to fault them for that. But I think there is some sort of shift. So yeah, this is a huge question. So sorry, it's not easy to answer concisely, but a lot of Indigenous nations or groups have underlying philosophies regarding respect for the earth. So they tend to be quite on board with renewables. And so I think what may have an impact there is a larger shift in sort of social legitimacy of energy, and the feasibility of engaging in renewables in a way that is accessible and affordable and profitable for them as well. But yeah, it's a really, they're in a tough position, I think. We've seen that. I worked a bit in my PhD in the Canadian tar sands, and the Indigenous communities there are in a really difficult spot because there's economic opportunity from the tar sands, but it's also destroying their livelihoods. So they're in a really tough position. Yeah, hopefully broader social change will mean that they have more options available to them than oil extraction.